public space has become a subject of academic, professional, and public attention. This is a welcome development, as few people would doubt about its value. But we may wonder why. Why is it so much the topic of attention now? Public spaces have always been an integral part of the city. So what are the reasons for this renewed interest in them? I look for answering this question in three interrelated and overlapping shifts in recent years, bringing about significant demographic, technological, political, economic, social, and cultural changes with direct implications for public spaces. The first shift is in technological and economic arrangements. Transport technologies have allowed the growing cities to disperse in all directions, a trend that continues to this day with major social and environmental implications. With the arrival of the information and communication technologies, it was thought that cities would disappear altogether. You could be anywhere and have access to all services and resources you needed. But there are many good reasons for cities to exist, from economies of scale to mutual social support and cultural richness of life, which is why urban living thrives, but needs to be supported by high-quality spaces. Provision and maintenance of public space now is a central theme of sustainable development in European strategic policy documents. All the various charters and strategies give specific prominence to public space. According to the European Environment Agencies, urban expansion needs to be restrained by creating compact cities. But compact cities should offer a high quality of life that would persuade people to stay in the city, rather than leaving for the suburbs and fueling the urban sprawl. Provision of public space is one of the key ingredients of high-quality environment, and the significance of parks and boulevards has been known for centuries. Now the emphasis is on all the green assets that a city can master, connected to each other to form a green infrastructure, which allows the wildlife to thrive, local food production to be enhanced, and connection with the natural world be maintained. The allotments that you see there from the UK, there's a list of 90,000 people on the waiting list to get a piece of allotment, which they use for pleasure or for production of food. Public spaces are reclaimed from the car. Pedestrians and bicycles are given more prominence. Civil society actors invest their energies in urban environment, like this guerrilla gardening, and a campaign for decluttering has started, for getting rid of the massive instructions that fill the urban space, which creates information overload and aesthetic disarray. Facilitated by technological change, the major economic shift in recent decades has been the globalization of industrial production, relocating the manufacturing industries from its old centers to new ones. This was not an accidental shift. It didn't happen like the weather. It was initiated by the companies that looked for cheaper factors of production and being free from labor disputes and environmental regulations. This fundamental economic change has had considerable impacts on the social and spatial organization of the city. It has fueled urbanization in industrializing cities, like in China, which is experiencing what may be the largest wave of urbanization in human history. It has also fueled transition to services in deindustrializing cities in the West, which these cities have been looking for alternative economic rationale to fill the gap. In both cases, public spaces play a mediating and facilitating role in economic transformation. Cities are engines of economic development, where the production, exchange, and consumption of goods takes place. A key driver of economic development is innovation, which draws on the encounters between different stakeholders, the meeting of minds, partly facilitated by the composition of the urban environment and support from a vibrant public sphere. Clustering the new companies in science parks, technopoles, and cultural quarters has become the holy grail of local economic development, thought to generate the critical mass that is needed for such innovation, bringing people together so that spark can fly. Economic development also draws on investment. In the Leipzig Charter in 2007, the European Ministers of Urban Development emphasized the role of public space in economic change. They called it soft locational factors that attract knowledge-based firms and tourists. In the context of globalization, where cities behave like private firms, competing with each other for investment, high-quality public spaces, tall buildings, and expressive architecture are all seen as symbolic assets, enhancing the image and the quality of a city on the global stage, all seen as devices that could distinguish in a city in the crowded global marketplace, much in the same way that advertising is meant to differentiate goods on supermarket shelves. The economic role of public space at the local level includes also building market confidence, creating attractive conditions for private developers to invest in an area, making and enhancing the land and property market. Some public authorities look for economic justification for investment in public space, and they find this justification in confidence building for the market, laying the foundations of a property market in declining areas where none existed, attracting private investors to an area, and seeing the rise in the land value as the ultimate justification for investment in public space. For private developers, good public spaces provide clear competitive advantage for the quality and market value of their development. The consumption of goods and services, now so thriving through globalization, is a major drive for the global economy. The more we consume goods and services, the faster the wheels of the economy, of the global economy. So consumption becomes a goal in itself, whether or not we need those products. To the extent that consumerism has become a primary identifier of the rich urban societies. Investment in public space is an essential ingredient of boosting this consumerism and experience economy. Public spaces provide the atmosphere of glitz and spectacle that would draw people to particular places where we can enjoy the pleasures of apparent abundance and being with others. But the fruits of economic development are not equally distributed. So the question becomes, are public spaces good for everyone, or do they serve only some people? In other words, whose public spaces are they? The second shift, which overlaps the first, is in the relationship between the public and private spheres. In political theory, the public sphere is often the sphere of the state, as distinctive from the private sphere of individuals and households. The two spheres are kept apart, as the intervention of the public sphere into the private would result in the loss of privacy and individual freedom, while the encroachment of the private sphere into the public sphere may create individual gain and collective loss. The cities of the Middle Ages looked very picturesque to us today, but they are the result of this tense interaction and competition for space between individuals who wanted. That's why these encroachments into the public sphere are so irregular. Cities of all times are shaped by this interplay between the public and private spheres. This relationship has been changing once again in recent decades as a result of globalization, with direct implications for public spaces. For a generation after the Second World War, a model of development emerged that was based on a tight regulation of the market by the state, stimulating demand through a better distribution of resources and improving the conditions of life in cities. The state was directly involved in the provision of public services and the production of the built environment. This period, which the French call the Glorious 30, could combine prosperity with a degree of equality. But it ran out of energy by the 1970s. The laissez-faire phase that followed, and has now been going on for the last 30 years, reduced the size and scope of the state, now seen as bureaucratic, clumsy, unaffordable, and ineffective. Instead, the values and methods of the market were embraced, radically changing the balance between the public and the private spheres. The Keynesian accord between the state and the market was broken, transferring the production of the built environment to the private sector. The spaces produced in the first period were often modernist spaces, designed from inside out, paying more attention to the buildings rather than the spaces outside. In this famous sketch by Le Corbusier, public spaces are, of course, pleasant and plentiful. The modernist manifesto, the Charter of Athens, had paid specific attention to public spaces as breathing spaces of the city, where they were essential in overcrowded and badly built cities. But in their design philosophy, public space was essentially at the service of buildings, enveloping and supporting it, in the same sense that they had this idea of green belts surrounding the cities, green spaces surrounding neighborhoods, open spaces surrounding buildings. Spaces were at the service of the building and the built-up area. But when these buildings went into decline, public spaces, spaces around them, became a huge problem, as people here in Sweden know very well. In the following period, the resources of the private firms were mobilized, which had access to huge productive capacities that could transform large parts of cities and regenerate declining areas, as in this case in the city centre of Liverpool in the UK. But these firms had a limited remit, responsible towards their shareholders rather than delivering services and spaces for the general public. Urban development projects still needed public spaces, but these new spaces were more functional intermediate spaces rather than publicly accessible ones. In an increasingly unequal society, the intermediate spaces they produced were privately controlled, sometimes with the help of guards, walls, gates, and cameras, setting boundaries that would limit access to these spaces. This reduction in supply and access opened up a crisis of confidence and a rising sense of anxiety about public spaces and services, and by extension, a crisis for the city as a whole. So much of the debate about public space has reflected anxiety about this changing relationship, which is a mirror of the broader relationship between the market and the state, and between the individual and society. When these fundamental relationships change, the features of society and its spaces change. The campaign for public space, in this sense, is a campaign for the integrity of the city and of society. The political significance of public space has long been known since the ancient times. The agora in Athens is often mentioned as the prototype of democratic public space, although spaces for some form of collective deliberation can be found in all cities and all cultures. Democracy has long been based on the development of an active public sphere, in which citizens are able to participate, communicate freely, and develop opinions about the affairs of their society, enabling them to make informed decisions in democratic governance. In both physical and institutional forms, public spaces make an important contribution to urban governance by becoming the focus of free expression, protest and conflict, as well as deliberation and collaboration between a wide range of actors, and becoming a vehicle of legitimacy for the public authorities that have lost much of their remit that they used to have, their earlier mandates in transforming the cities. As non-state actors have proliferated, the challenge of urban governance has included setting up frameworks for collaboration and cooperation and the formation of collective actors. Strategic plans and large urban projects, in this case Vienna's Central Station, has become a prominent form of urban development in Europe, based on partnerships between the public sector and these non-state actors, and revolving around a series of public spaces. Focus on the process of design and development of these projects would allow the development of a shared vision and a spatial focus of attention. The private control of urban space, however, is a continuing concern. The urban spectacle is supported by events and festivals set up to support commercialism, dominated by commercial messages and control of large corporations, to the extent that campaigners in the UK complain about the emergence of cloned towns, whereby all high streets are dominated by the same companies, making them all similar to one another. The production and management of public space by private companies continues to cause similar complaints. Even the business-friendly Mayor of London, in his manifesto for public space that you see on the right, announces his concern, which is quoted on the right. You see his quote here. There is a growing trend towards private management of publicly accessible spaces. And that's why the London Assembly, on the left, in its report that you see there, suggests tighter controls are needed to ensure public spaces remain accessible and in public hands. Similarly, the viability of many public services, such as public transport, libraries, and museums, is under pressure in the periods of economic austerity. Austerity, though, is not a universal problem, and many cities around the world continue to grow in size and prosperity and carry on investing in their public spaces. In unequal societies, however, a privatized form of public space may be taken to be the norm. Now, what makes a place public? Here from the city center of Stockholm. If we were to answer this question with just one word, it would be access. The key feature of public space is its accessibility. The more accessible a place, the more public it becomes. Access cannot be abstract and universal, of course. It is the expression of relationships between people, an expression of power and control over territory, an interplay of inclusion and exclusion. So it always takes different forms and levels, and that's why a city is full of shades of public-private relations, from the most public to the most private. The boundaries that separate the public and private spheres from one another manage this access. And in doing so, they characterize a society. One of the orthodoxies in urban design advocates clear boundaries between the two realms. But harsh and strict boundaries, as in this case in South Africa, suggest unequal societies where fear and threat of violence rule. Highly articulate, soft and porous boundaries, in contrast, the same sort of architecture, but more open and accessible and friendlier towards the public sphere, show a more peaceful and sophisticated encounter between the public and the private, and a more urbane society. The boundaries between the public and private spheres are never fixed, dividing the urban world into a sharp dualism. Instead, it is always evolving and interdependent. But anxieties rise when one side seems to be losing the ground and the other side taking over. The third shift is in the growth and diversification of urban society. The world is now officially urban, with more than half of the world population living in cities, and which are growing at much faster rates. Even in Europe, where population is fairly stable and 80% of the population already live in urban areas, larger cities are growing rapidly, albeit at the expense of smaller towns and cities, as well as through international migration. In this urban world, public spaces are particularly significant on many levels. As more people come to cities, they need the essential spaces that facilitate social life, a common infrastructure of institutions and spaces that is a vital prerequisite for making collective life possible. It is in the DNA of urban life, which is very clearly evident in informal settlements around the world. These are places where we can witness the birth of an urban area, where consolidation of housing is followed by the development of local public spaces. These are areas that are dismissed as slums. But if you look at them, they follow exactly the same path as historic cities have followed, where people's ingenuity and imagination create the spaces necessary for a decent collective life. Alongside the growth of urban populations, social diversity and inequality has increased. With the economic and political shift towards the market and with globalization, the growth of social inequality is detectable in most countries. As these various reports by the EU, OECD, and the UK government show, social inequality has grown over the past 3 decades, alongside the other forms of shift that I was talking about, alongside the changing model of economic development and the shifting boundaries between the public and private spheres. Also, with globalization and international migrations, smaller households and increasing diversity and variety of lifestyles, the urban populations are more diverse than ever before. In the transition from manufacturing to services, the organization of social groups and urban spaces has been changing. Blue-collar workers had once shaped the industrial cities with their rigid routines of life and mass patterns of consumption and socialization. With the relocation of industries to other places, blue-collar workers are being replaced by white-collar workers who work in services with their flexible routines of work and diversified patterns of consumption. And they are served by an army of casual and underpaid workers from around the world. Gentrification, in this case in Tokyo, this huge complex is specifically sold as a gentrification project, facilitates this displacement and replacement of one group with another. It is a widespread phenomenon around the world. This is a particular development because Mr. Mori, who developed this area, is a tower builder, and his vision is to transform Tokyo into a city of towers. Public space improvements, whether by public authorities, civil society activists, or private companies, adjust the city's spaces for its inhabitants, which is understandable, as you see in these cases from private organizations, civil society organizations, and municipalities and local activists. But in doing so, in adjusting the city to its inhabitants, they may knowingly or unknowingly facilitate displacement and gentrification. On the receiving end, ghettoization, homelessness, and sudden bursts of anger in terms of riots are some of the ways these changes find expression in public spaces. But anger and protest are not limited to the invisible and deprived minorities. They're also displayed by the mainstream casualties of these major transitions, as now being played out in public spaces in all continents. These are just examples from European capitals in recent months and years. Meanwhile, a series of social movements have pushed for broadening the meaning of the public. The word public refers to people as a whole, and theoretically includes everyone. But in practice, it has tended towards a narrow definition, without taking the diversity of society and the different positions and needs of its members into account. Women have argued that cities have been historically built and run by men, undermining women's roles and needs. In the distinction between the public and the private, men have dominated the public sphere of work and politics, pushing women to a domestic sphere in which they could be controlled and suppressed. City design clearly reflected this unequal arrangement, whereby industrialization separated the world of work from home, suburbanization trapped women in isolated peripheries, socialization became limited to the spaces of consumption, and the design and management of urban spaces remained insensitive to women's needs. Alongside women's movement, ethnic and cultural minorities have also argued for their right to the city, overcoming the actual and symbolic barriers that deny them access to particular places and activities. They have demanded to be represented in the public domain rather than being ignored, undermined, or suppressed. In the design of the urban environment, the standards are set by the able-bodied and mobile people, while the elderly and the disabled have often been ignored, and their reduced mobility was seen as a regrettable but inevitable fact of life. But now, in aging societies, the pressure is on to address their needs. For a person with a reduced mobility, moving in most public spaces is really a struggle, continually having to negotiate impassable barriers. Many cities have now started adopting measures for widening access to those with reduced mobility, either in a wheelchair, pushchair, or just having difficulty in negotiating steps and differential levels. Children are the core of the nuclear family and historic nuclear family, and their significance has grown enormously in modern family life. Their presence in public spaces has been managed through a combination of ordering and protection. The provision of playgrounds has acknowledged the need to cater for children, and the fear of anonymity and the rising crime levels in the city, all leading to forms of protective behavior, but also limiting the presence of children to protected places, specialist areas, monitored places. Young people in public spaces, meanwhile, become considered as threat to the order, to others, closely watched for any misbehavior that would unsettle the calm order of the city. When fear of crime has risen, all vulnerable groups have withdrawn from public spaces. The tension between the vulnerable elderly people and the energetic teenagers is one of those key themes that you see in a lot of housing areas around Europe. It's one of those main themes in many neighborhoods. With social diversification and historical change come tensions over identity. With its monuments and collective experiences, public space forms an integral part of the urban identity, folding many layers of history into tight corners of urban space. But when people or places change, a crisis of representation is evident. Whose identity does or should the public spaces represent? Some elements of the past simply turn into an aesthetic experience, losing their meaning and significance in the mist of time. Nobody knows who that statue belonged to, when at the time it was something of a magnitude that is no longer felt. When the city's history includes troubled memories, like many examples in Eastern Europe nowadays or in a lot of other places, when they are treated simply as belonging to an unremarkable period in history, like the attitude during the period of high modernism, they represent new challenges. Should they be kept and remembered, or should they be removed and forgotten? As bad memories or insignificant heritage, they put forward the dilemma that many cities face all the time. I've only touched on a simplified outline of these major shifts in urban societies to show their implications for public space, opening lines of discussion that each need a long time to develop. They show, I hope, the significance of public space, its direct connection with wider urban processes, its important role, the obstacles facing vulnerable groups, and challenges that cities need to address. Public spaces are crossroads where different paths and trajectories meet or collide, the stage on which the public life unfolds, the essential realm of sociability. The key attraction of public space is its people, and its defining feature is open accessibility. Most of the images that we see as good public spaces are from city centers and their busy streets, where a lot of happy people fill a vibrant and colorful place. This image is a proxy for a good city and good life, where people are present in accessible and open spaces, living a prosperous and peaceful life. The test of the good city, however, is that it is good in all its parts and for all its people. This is not just a utopian dream. The social movements that I mentioned have been effective in bringing to the social agenda the necessity of catering for the needs of those who have been ignored for long. They have shown that it is possible to change the attitudes and the emphasis if there is enough interest and energy. Events like this show that there is plenty of energy and interest. Thank you.